Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? So in this video I'm going to make a double-sided chessboard for Ed Trice. On one side it's going to have 64 squares for traditional chess, and then you can flip it over and it'll have 80 squares on the other side for Gothic chess, or what's now being called Trice's chess. Some mathematicians might argue that it actually has 276 squares, and it does, but for chess purposes we'll stick with 80 squares. Now, since it has a different layout on each side, I can't cut thick pieces of wood to go all the way through to form the squares. So I'm going to use a 1/2-inch thick piece of Baltic birch plywood to be a substrate, and I will glue 1/2-inch thick squares on either side. That will give me the ability to have two different layouts. One of the advantages of using plywood is that it's very stable, so it will help to minimize any potential wood movement of the individual squares as they expand and contract through seasonal changes. So let's get started. Using my crosscut sled, I'm setting the stop block to be 5/8 of an inch away from the blade. That gives me a little bit of excess so that after the next glue up I can still sand the squares and get down to a 1/2 inch in thickness. I'll start by cleaning and squaring up the end, and then I'll cut a series of slices that are 5/8 of an inch thick. And I'll go about halfway across the length, and then it's easier to do it without the crosscut sled and just use my fence. The wood I used is walnut and ash, and the squares will be 2 1/4 inches in size. This piece was about 15 inches long, and really for 5/8 of an inch plus an 1/8 of an inch kerf on the blade, I really only needed it to be a good 12 inches, but this gave me the ability to cut a few extra pieces, which was good because you can see there are some flaws, at least in this piece, so I had some replacements that I could use. Now I'm cutting some special cauls. These are designed to fit over the plywood lip and apply pressure onto the chessboard squares. For the plywood core, I changed my plan and decided to use 3/4 inch plywood to give the board a little bit more heft. The side of the board that's going to have 10 squares is going to be 22.5 inches wide. So I'm cutting the plywood to be 23.5 inches, and this piece needs to be square, even though it's rectangular on one side. The overall frame and the board needs to be square. I'm applying some packing tape to the cauls so that they don't stick to the pieces that I'm gluing up. It's important to apply an ample amount of glue, especially with end grain, because the end grain acts like little tiny straws that suck up the glue. So after applying a coat, I'm applying another coat before I put them onto the board. And it's important to apply glue to the edges of the squares as well so that they stick together nicely. Otherwise, with expansion and contraction of the wood, as the seasons change, the squares will separate. When arranging the pieces on the Gothic chess side, it's really important to make sure that you have a white square in the lower right-hand corner. If you don't, it's not like a regular chessboard where you can just rotate it 90 degrees because it's a rectangle. If it's not a white square in the bottom right-hand corner, then it'll never work. The calls are important not only for clamping, but also for positioning the pieces so that they're centered on the board. And I'll put a sheet of plywood on top and add some weights to provide some downward pressure. It's important to have that downward force before I start to clamp up the squares, because otherwise they may buckle and push upward. I like to put as much weight as I can on the board, especially around the edges, to make sure that it's glued up correctly. When gluing up the second side with the 64 squares, the only thing I have to pay attention to is to make sure that I have the wood arranged in a way that it appears that the wood is traveling all the way through the board. So I want to have the same color square in the lower right-hand corner as I do on the other side when you look through. Even with all the care that I took with the weights on the top of the board, it's still not flat on the top and bottom, so I'll run it a few times through the drum sander. I think the only way I could get it perfectly flat on the top and the bottom during the glue up would be to have some kind of a hydraulic press. But even then, some sanding would be required. I left myself 1/8 of an inch excess, so it was pretty easy to sand down to 1/2 an inch without worrying that I was going to go too far and sand it to be too thin. And now I'll just clean up the edges on the table saw to make sure that they are straight and square. For the frame, I'm using a 6/4 inch piece of walnut, and I'm going to start by cutting it in half because it was really too long to run through the jointer without wasting a lot of material. And then I'll run it through the planer. I'm not worried about a particular thickness, I just want to get it flat on both sides, and then I will resaw it using my bandsaw. I'm aiming to end up with two pieces that are about 5/8 of an inch thick. And you can see at the end of the cut there was a lot of tension released in the walnut. So I let that sit for a week to let it relax a little bit, and then I ran it through the planer to get it down to the final thickness. And now with my miter gauge set to 45 degrees, I'm cutting the pieces for the frame on the standard chess side, the side with 64 squares. And I'm using my clamps during the test fit just to make sure the joints are correct. Obviously, I didn't have the miter joints fitting perfectly after the first cut. I purposely cut them longer than they needed to be, and then I snuck up on the length until everything was fitting perfectly. Now the angles on the other side are a little different because it's a rectangle. So I'm setting my miter gauge to be 26.6 degrees. And the way that it works, if you want to get a fraction of an angle, line the 0 with the 26, And then with each tick mark, each time the bottom tick mark aligns with the upper tick mark, that's 0.1 degrees. So I'll go over 6 tick marks that need to align, and this one on the left-hand side, when it aligns, that's 0.6 degrees. And with the two thinner frame pieces, I've set the angle to be 63.4 degrees. And with such a steep angle, it's important to have the piece of wood clamped to the miter gauge. And now I'm using my Laguna CNC machine to carve the algebraic notation. I've done this by hand with a router before, but with such a high-end board, I wanted to make sure that the letters were perfect. And then for the numbers, for the rank, I'm cutting them only on one side. And this is important for the glue up to make sure that when I glue it up, I have the numbers on the right side. And now I'm filling the notation with black epoxy. And then the next day I ran it through the drum sander. Now it's time to cut the groove in the frame pieces that are going to fit around the plywood tongue. And because I'm using 3/4 inch plywood, which is really only about 0.7 inches thick, I'm setting my dado blade to be just a little bit higher than that, and then I'll cut the groove. Now the groove only needs to be a 1/2 inch deep, or just a little bit more than a 1/2 inch to leave a bit of an air gap. But for some of the pieces I need a much deeper groove to fit over the plywood. And for this last cut, I slipped a little piece of wood under the frame to support it so that it wouldn't collapse and fall down onto the blade. Now it's time for the glue up, and I'm using Titebond 3 for this. And for this first glue up, I have the frame pieces for the other side in place just to support the frame as I'm gluing it on. And I apply glue to the plywood and also to the mitered cuts of the walnut. And because it's end grain, the glue gets sucked up pretty quickly. So before putting the pieces in place, I put a second coat of glue on the mitered joints. So at this point, I don't have much to say about what I'm doing in the video, so let's talk about Gothic chess, or Trice's chess. I'm making this board for Ed Trice, and he's the inventor of this chess variant. He did not invent the 8x10 board. That's been around since the 1500s. There have been similar chess variants using an 8x10 board, including Carrera's chess from 1617, Bird's chess from 1874, and Capablanca's chess from the 1920s. What Ed invented was the placement of the pieces. I put some cauls on the top so that I could apply some downward force to make sure that the frame pieces were glued properly to the plywood. Now, before I do the second glue up, I'm cutting these little triangles to fill some gaps, and you'll see why when we go back to the board. And you can see there are little triangular gaps on the underside, and that's because of the different angles and the different layouts of the two boards. So I'm just filling those with some little triangles. This is a lot more complicated glue up on this side because there's so much more surface area. So I'm using Tight Bond Extend on this side to give me more open time. Normally for chessboard frames that have mitered corners, I would use either splines or mortise and tenon joinery in the corners. But because of the different angles and different dimensions on the top and bottom, there's enough overlap that when the pieces are glued together, they'll be plenty strong. To play this game, there are 4 additional pieces, 2 pawns and 2 additional pieces called a Chancellor and an Archbishop. The Chancellor has the combined powers of a rook and a knight, and the Archbishop has the powers of a bishop and a knight. Ed was able to demonstrate that with Capablanca's chess, the white player always had an advantage and could win in as few as 6 moves. What Ed invented back in the year 2000 was the placement of the pieces, with the Archbishop and Chancellor being on either side of the king. The Chancellor is placed between the king and the queen, and the Archbishop is placed between the king and the bishop. This allows all pawns to be protected in the opening array. Now that the glue up is done, I will run 2 edges through the jointer to make sure they're straight and flat. And then I'll run the other 2 edges through the table saw. Next, I'm going to apply the edge banding, and I will start by cutting a dado around the perimeter of the chessboard frame. The edge banding is primarily decorative, but in this case it also helps to hide the glue line. The glue line in this case is almost invisible, but the edge banding takes it away altogether. And I have plenty of tiger maple left over from other projects, so I'm just cutting some 45-degree miters on each corner, and then I will glue it in place. Ed told me that Bobby Fischer took an interest in Gothic chess back in the early 2000s, and then the two played a game together. And then in 2006, with $15 million from a group of investors, Ed made a couple of trips to Iceland to try to convince Bobby Fischer to compete against Anatoly Karpov, as Karpov had already signed the contract. After a difficult negotiation, Bobby Fischer ended up dying in 2008 before the match could be held. And then I'll just run it through the table saw to remove the excess tiger maple, and I take a little bit of the frame off as well just to make sure that it's entirely flat. It takes a lot of sanding to get rid of the marks from the drum sander, and I started with 80 grit and worked all the way up to 220 grit. It's probably a good hour of sanding here. And then prior to applying a finish, I'm just wetting it down with water. This helps to raise the grain. And after it dries, then I'll sand it one more time. And then I'll wipe it down with shellac. This is a de-waxed shellac so that the varnish will adhere. After applying the shellac, I sanded it again, and then I proceeded outside to spray it with pre-catalyzed lacquer. I applied 4 coats of the finish before I realized that I forgot to put the number on the chessboard, because this is going to be the first in a numbered series. So I took it back to the CNC machine. It looks pretty nice in the machine now because it's already got the finish on it. And it's carving number 1. And then I applied 2 more coats of pre-cat lacquer, so it's got 6 coats in total, which is going to make it quite durable. So I gotta ask, would you make it?